Susie Wiles sat in the courtroom, clenching her cold fingers into a fist. She was not guilty. She knew it. But there was a looming threat in the air, invisible, yet palpable, like the scent of old wood and the faint aroma of coffee drifting from the corridor. Ms. Wiles, Judge Carter's voice, cold and detached, made her lift her head. He sat elevated, slightly leaning forward, as if trying to pierce her with his gaze. His eyes were as dark as thick night. "Do you understand the seriousness of the charges against you?" Susie slowly inhaled. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied in a steady voice. A tense silence filled the room. It seemed as though even the old fan in the corner had frozen. Susie could feel the eyes of the people in the courtroom, journalists, lawyers, police officers, even the random bystanders. She knew they had already made their judgment long before the proceedings began. The charges were serious: document forgery, embezzlement of state funds. But Susie knew the truth. It had been set up, and she knew by whom. Carter paused, letting the words settle in the air before continuing. "Your lawyer insists that all the evidence is fabricated." But he made a barely noticeable gesture with his hand, and the door to the right of the judge's seat opened. 2 police officers entered the room. "However, if we're talking about the law," Susie met the judge's gaze. She saw the hidden satisfaction behind the calm in his eyes. He wanted to see her broken, but she wouldn't allow it. "I must order your arrest," Carter said, and a barely perceptible smile appeared at the corner of his lips. One of the officers began moving towards her. Susie clenched her fists, but remained in place. Her heart was pounding in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. She wouldn't let him win. "Excuse me, Your Honor," a voice suddenly rang out from the back of the room. All heads turned towards the door. A man in a sharp suit entered the room. His dark hair was neatly combed back, and his face held the confidence of someone who knew they had complete control over the situation. "Who are you?" Judge Carter tilted his head, his voice sharp. "Detective Mark Grayson, Internal Affairs Division." The man raised his badge, and a slight gasp of surprise passed through the courtroom. Carter narrowed his eyes. "And what is this about?" "The thing is, we've just completed an investigation into you, Your Honor." Grayson's voice remained calm, but there was steel in it. "And by order of the department, I am forced to arrest you." A dead silence fell over the room. Carter froze, his face paling. "This is some kind of mistake," he hissed. "No mistake," Grayson nodded to the officers. "Your Honor, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say may and will be used against you in court." 2 officers moved toward the judge. Carter stood up, abruptly pushing the chair back, but the officer's hands were already on his shoulders. Susie slowly exhaled, but there was a steel gleam in her eyes. She knew the fight was not over yet, but the first step had been taken. 8 minutes ago, Judge Carter had complete control of the situation. Now everything had changed. Susie sat at the table in the interrogation room, the walls painted pale gray, and the only lamp above her head casting harsh white light on her face. She kept her hands on her knees, maintaining a calm expression, even though her heart beat faster than usual. Across from her sat Judge Harrison, a stocky man with graying temples and a piercing gaze that exuded cold superiority. "Well, Susie," he began, clasping his hands together, "we need to talk about how you decided to interfere in a case that has nothing to do with you." Susie slowly lifted her gaze and looked him directly in the eyes. "If you're referring to the case against Ben Rivers, then, as a judge, I had every right to point out procedural violations." Harrison smiled faintly at the corner of his mouth. "Procedural violations, huh? I would call it an interference in the work of senior colleagues. And interference is a serious crime in our system. If the system is corrupt, then interference is a duty," Susie said quietly but firmly. Harrison's eyes narrowed. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Let me explain what happens next. You will be charged with abuse of power and unauthorized access to confidential materials. That means losing your judicial license and probably facing a suspended sentence. It's the end of your career, Susie. Susie kept her calm demeanor, but her fingers tightened slightly on her knees. And what exactly did I do? Harrison leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest. You accessed Rivers' files without permission. And who exactly closed access to those files? Susie asked. Harrison squinted slightly. It doesn't matter. It does, Susie replied, because access to those files was closed by an order signed by you. And I'm sure that in the event of an investigation, that can be easily confirmed. Harrison maintained his stone-faced expression. You closed access to materials that contained evidence of falsifications in the Rivers case, Susie continued. And I just made sure that evidence became available to the defense. You have no evidence, Harrison replied coldly. Susie smiled just barely. I have more than you think. She slowly placed a small flash drive on the table. This device contains phone call recordings, bank transfers, and even documented meetings between you and the prosecution in the Rivers case. Harrison turned pale. You? No, it wasn't me. It was the work of a group of investigators who've been monitoring your activities for several months. And now they know you're here. Harrison tried to hide the nervous tremor in his hands. This proves nothing. At that moment, the door swung open, and two police officers in dark blue uniforms entered the room. One of them held an arrest warrant. Judge Harrison, you are under arrest on suspicion of corruption, evidence tampering, and abuse of office. The officer's voice was calm but firm. Harrison stood up, but the officers had already cuffed his hands. This is a misunderstanding, he shouted, but his voice wavered. I'm a judge. You can't do this. Susie rose from her chair. From now on, justice is being restored. Harrison yelled something else, but the officers were already escorting him out of the room. Susie looked at the flash drive left on the table. She felt the tension in her body gradually ease. In the doorway stood a young detective in a gray suit, Detective Richards. Great work, Judge Wiles, he said respectfully. We've been waiting for this moment. Susie nodded. This is just the beginning. She picked up the flash drive from the table and followed the detective out of the room. Voices of journalists and camera shutters echoed down the corridor. As she walked past, someone asked, Susie, did you know that Harrison was going to be arrested? Susie paused for a moment and answered, I knew that the truth always prevails in the end. She stepped out into the cold air of the modern metropolis, where amidst the sounds of sirens and the noise of cars, something in the atmosphere had shifted. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Susie stood on the wide landing in front of the courthouse, as cameras and microphones from all sides pointed toward her. Journalists surrounded her, pushing and shouting questions. Susie, how do you comment on the arrest of Judge Harrison? Is it true that he cooperated with criminal organizations? Did you know about this beforehand? She stepped forward, raised her hand, demanding silence, and spoke in a steady voice. Judge Harrison broke the law. The facts about his actions will be presented to the public during the official investigation. I cannot comment on the details at this time. She lowered her hand and turned toward the stairs when a familiar voice broke through the crowd. Susie. She turned and saw Detective Richards hurrying toward her with a serious expression on his face. He held an envelope sealed with red tape. We found this in Harrison's office, he said, extending the envelope to her. I think you should take a look at this personally. Susie took the envelope and immediately felt her heart tighten. She quickly tore off the tape and pulled out several sheets of paper. The first was a list of names. She skimmed through it and her blood ran cold. What is this? She asked, though she already felt the answer in her gut. This is a list of judges and prosecutors whom Harrison bribed, Richards replied. And he's not the only one in this scheme. Susie lowered her eyes to the sheet. Among the names she recognized, there were those she had considered honest and incorruptible. The last name made her freeze. John Wiles, she felt something heavy settle on her chest. Her father, this is a mistake, she whispered. Richards placed a hand on her shoulder. We checked bank transfer records and phone calls. His connection with Harrison is documented. Susie felt a chill run down her spine. She took a step back, clenching the paper in her hand. No. My father. He would never. Richards looked at her seriously. I understand how hard this is. But the facts don't lie. She grabbed the railing of the stairs, feeling her legs weaken. Her head spun. Her father, John Wiles, had been the epitome of morality and integrity for all the judges in the city. And now he was the main suspect in Harrison's corruption scheme. Richards leaned slightly toward her. What do we do now, Susie? She took a deep breath, trying to organize her thoughts. If this was true, she couldn't back down. The truth had no exceptions, even when it came to her own father. We'll take this case to the end, she said, looking up at Richards. If my father is guilty, he must face the law. Richards nodded. Then we'll have to dig up even more dirt. And I'm sure this is just the tip of the iceberg. Susie stepped away from the crowd of journalists and walked toward the black car waiting at the sidewalk. Richard sat next to her. Where are we going? The driver asked. Susie looked at the list of names trembling in her hands. Her eyes lingered on John Wiles' surname. To my father's, she answered quietly. In 30 minutes, they stood in front of the large house in the suburbs. The white fence, the well-kept garden, the light from the windows cutting through the evening darkness. Susie opened the gate and took a deep breath. The door opened before she had a chance to knock. John Wiles stood in the doorway, a tall, elegant man with gray at his temples and piercing brown eyes. Susie, he said, smiling, I didn't expect you so late. She raised the sheet with the list and handed it to him. Can you explain this? John took the sheet, read it, and froze for a moment. His face remained calm, but something like concern flashed in his eyes. Where did you get this? He asked quietly. In Harrison's office. Is it true? Her voice rang with tension. John sighed and took a step back, gesturing for her to come inside. Susie, you'd better sit down. I'll explain everything. No. She stayed at the door. Tell me the truth right now. John looked at her with a long, heavy gaze. This is complicated, he finally said. But yes, I worked with Harrison. Susie felt a chill in her chest. You took bribes? No, he shook his head. I tried to protect people. Harrison controlled the judicial system through pressure and threats. I agreed to stay silent to protect your mother. And you, why didn't you tell me earlier? Her voice trembled. Because it was dangerous, he said quietly. Harrison had connections in the police, the prosecutor's office, even the mayor's office. If I had spoken out, he would have destroyed us. Susie shook her head, trying to cope with the wave of emotions. And what now? She whispered. John looked at her with pain in his eyes. That depends on you. If you want to see this through, I'll help. But be prepared for the consequences, to be serious. Susie looked at him, feeling fear and determination intertwining in her heart. We'll go all the way, she replied firmly. Together. Susie sat in the prosecutor's office, examining the documents laid out on the desk. The lamp cast a soft light on the papers, a list of names, bank transfers, phone call records. These were the pieces of evidence, enough to initiate a case against all the figures involved in the corruption scheme. John Wiles sat across from her, his hands folded on the desk. There was fatigue in his eyes, but also relief. He was no longer hiding in the shadows. They'll go all the way to stop us, he said. Harrison may be behind bars, but he has friends on the outside. Susie looked up. I know. There was a knock at the door, and Detective Richards entered the office. His face was serious. We just received arrest warrants for 3 judges and 2 prosecutors. They tried to destroy the evidence, but our people managed to intercept the documents. And what's next? Susie asked. Richard sat down on a chair by the table. Next, the real war begins. They will fight to the last. They fear that if one falls, they all will. Susie nodded, running through all possible scenarios in her head. She knew that not only her reputation, but also the lives of those who chose to stand on the side of truth would be at risk. "We're ready," she said confidently. John looked at her with pride in his eyes. "I'm proud of you, Susie." She smiled slightly. "I'm just doing my job." "No," he shook his head. "You're doing much more. You're breaking a system that has existed for decades." Susie looked at the list of names. Some of them were familiar from her childhood, family friends, her father's colleagues, people she had trusted. But trust no longer mattered. "Richards," she said, lifting her gaze, "we start today. Announce the arrests publicly. I want them to know the game is over." Richards nodded and stood up. "I'll take care of it." He left the office, leaving Susie and John alone. She stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the night city. "Do you think they'll give up?" John asked. She shook her head. "No. But it doesn't matter. We won't back down." John walked over to her, placing his hand on her shoulder. "Whatever happens, I'm here with you." She looked at him, allowing herself a moment of weakness. "You were part of this, Dad. And now you have to answer for it." "I know," he said quietly. "And I'm ready." She squeezed his hand and then stepped back a step. "Richards will make the protocol. You need to give official testimony." "All right." She looked him in the eyes. "I love you, Dad. But I won't let the law be bent for anyone's interests." John nodded. "I know that. And that's why I'm proud of you." She took a step back and headed for the door. "Let's begin." John remained standing by the window, watching Susie leave the office with a confident stride, heading down the long corridor. She was moving forward towards danger, pressure, and possibly betrayal. But now she knew she was on the right path. Leaving the past behind, Susie was ready to tear down the system from within, even if it meant destroying everything she once believed in.